I realize as I press record, I really need a haircut. Hi, I'm Charles. This is my SirBookSage channel, and today I am doing a question and answer video. And I'm asking the questions to myself in this particular one. Since I've gained a lot of new followers over the past 4 or 5 months, I figured this would be kind of an updated introduction video in a sense. And I decided to channel my inner Daniel Milner and make this video in this sort of black and white style. He's a photographer who does really interesting photography channel. And he does a whole Q&A series of videos as part of his stuff. Anyway, totally off point. So let's get down to the question and answer. Question number 1. What are you currently reading? For those who may not be aware, I'm mainly a science fiction and fantasy reader, and I'm usually in the middle of pretty long series. Right now, I'm in the middle of 3 particular series. One is Malazan, the second is the Walt Longmire Mysteries, and the third one is the David Weber's Honor Harrington sort of space opera series. Now, for those who may not be aware, Malazan is a 10-book epic fantasy, high fantasy, like giant door-stopping book series written by Steven Erikson. It's Malazan Book of the Fallen, and it's 10 books. There's also a 6-book companion series written by Ian Esselmont that takes place alongside this main story. And the companion series, from what I've read so far, it's a lot of the characters, when they're not on page in the main series, you get to see what they're kind of doing off stage in their own stuff that's happening outside of the central events. Usually people will read the 10-book Malazan Book of the Fallen series, and then they'll go read the 6-book companion series. Me being me, I decided I'm going to read all 16 books together in a reading order for the very first time. So I did some research like a year or so ago, 2 years ago maybe at this point, and I found an interesting reading order that gets it as close to chronological between all 16 books as you can kind of get. And that's what I'm working my way through. I'm currently reading Reaper's Gale, which is book 7 of the main 10-book series, but it's book 9 in the overall 16 books put together. And I'm 380 pages in, really enjoying it. A bit unexpected for how this book has started compared to the last couple of books have been leading towards this thing, and now we're kind of taking a whole detour. But still beginning to set up this expected confrontation that hopefully is coming in this book. Now, you would think when you get to book 7 of a 10-book series, the author wouldn't introduce any major like game-changing characters, that you pretty much have everyone you're going to have. But this is Malazan, and so there's this brand new character called Red Mask, who is what I've described as a wrecking ball. Because there are hundreds, and I mean hundreds of characters in this series. To give you kind of a clue as to what I'm talking about, the breadth, scope, and depth and density of this series, if you've read The Wheel of Time, the 14-book series, the first 11 of which are written by Robert Jordan, the final 3 by Brandon Sanderson. Wheel of Time is a nice warm-up to reading something like Malazan. Like when you're going to work out and you do that stretch your muscles first before you get to your workout, Wheel of Time is that pre-workout stretch comparatively. And Wheel of Time, I love Wheel of Time. Brilliant, brilliant series. For those who are worried about the slog, worth every moment that you have to get through that sort of middle section before you get to the final 4 books that just bring it all home and really nail that series. Malazan is an undertaking. You have multiple empires, multiple armies. You get to see all these different facets of an army, from the generals down to grunts. Some of the fighting you're seeing sort of like the generals up on the hill kind of relaying tactics and strategy, and you switch to like some of their grunts in the middle, in the thick of it, fighting like street to street in this town, trying not to get themselves killed, trying to survive, trying to kill as many of the enemy as they can, while trying to get the hell out of there. So, and the battle scenes in this are probably the best battle scenes I've ever read in fantasy up to this point. There are also wizards, and there are these things called warrens where you can open up a warren that has its own kind of set of powers and demons and all sorts of things you can pull out and wield in the regular world. And then you can also use a warren to travel from one location to another. It's really interesting. You never know what's going to happen. And you have these sort of big, giant moving pieces between, you have this empire that's beginning to sort of crumble, and all this fighting that's now rising up on its borders and internally while everyone's squabbling for what's going to take over next. And instead, in stroll these gods, and just they're up to their own devices. Sometimes you'll have a god just directly intervene. Sometimes you might have a god, I think, disguised as somebody else, trying to meddle without anyone knowing who they are. All sorts of craziness goes on in this series. And but you have these certain characters that come along that I call wrecking balls. Karsa Urlong is one, Ikariam is another, and now we have this Red Mask. Now, I'd be very surprised, quite frankly, if this Red Mask character is going to be around the rest of the series. I think at most, I expect him to kind of, if he survives this book, he won't survive the next book. That's kind of the impression I get. But we'll see, because you already have 3 other just like cataclysmic, catastrophic wrecking balls that are all beginning to converge and just like barrel full blown into each other. It's a sort of confrontation that's been building for multiple books now. So this is kind of like all of a sudden this like distraction over here. It's interesting, but I don't know where this is going to go and how long it's going to keep us from this like inevitable clash of these couple of characters. We'll see. Really, really interesting series so far. And again, while I'm on book 7 of the main series, I'm just entering the second half of the overall 16-book read. Walt Longmire is a sheriff in a fictional county of Absaroka in Wyoming, and kind of modern day, set today. And the stories, this first few stories were written, I think, back in the 80s, maybe. I'm not sure how long ago. There's like 19 books at this point. But the character is like a Vietnam vet, and now he's a sheriff. And there's this Cheyenne reservation and a Crow reservation in the books that I think are in the county. So it kind of deals with the overlapping and like jurisdiction and all this kind of stuff. The TV series gets into that a lot more than the books have so far, but really, really good stuff. I'm a big, big fan of the TV show that is based on this series of books, the Longmire TV show. When I finally finished watching that series, I sat down to read The Cold Dish, because I wanted to see what the actual book characters were like compared to how the show presents them. So I sat down, bought the ebook and Audible of the first book, put it on, started reading, and just got sucked right in. Read the whole thing in a couple of hours. Bought book 2, barreled right through that as well. And then I decided, well, let me go put back on the pilot episode of the TV show. Watch maybe the first 2 episodes to now look for book-specific things that the showrunners made sure to include in those opening couple of episodes for the long-standing book readers. So I put those on and started picking out, okay, this is straight from the book, these couple of things. And then I got sucked right into the TV series again, and I binged the entire series a second time. And what's happening now is the Walt Longmire books are becoming kind of a palate cleanser in between Malazan, because these Malazan books are so big and dense. It's nice to have this like pretty easy, straightforward, sort of modern day sort of sheriff mystery books to read, because they're so different. They're so much more relaxing, and I absolutely love these characters. Don't know what it is yet about these characters in these books, and they're really done well in the TV show as well, but they click with me, and this writing style of Craig Johnson clicks with me as well, even though this is way outside my normal sci-fi and fantasy reading. So really enjoying this series. The problem, however, is every time I read like 2 Walt Longmire books, I end up going, well, let me just go back and look at those first couple of episodes again to see if there's stuff from these. Suck right in, and I re-binge the entire TV show again. So I'm currently in early in season 5 of my current watch of this series, which I think is going to be number 4 or number 5. So I need to balance that out because I can't re-binge 6 series of a TV show every time I read one of these books. So I'll work that out. But it's a really nice palate cleanser, and I'm really enjoying them. The Bosch TV show is based on another series of books, and I've read the first one, The Black Echo, and I really enjoyed that as well. So once I'm done with the Walt Longmire books, Bosch is probably going to become the next sort of this style of genre or whatever books that I'll be reading, because I really like that character as well. The third series I'm currently in the middle of reading is a space opera series, the Honor Harrington series by David Weber. I actually have a first impressions Honor Harrington video I filmed, I think probably a couple of years ago now, where I talked about my feelings about the series after having read the first like 4 or 5 books. And I actually quite like it. Now, someone just have to comment on that video just a day or two ago, where they mentioned they like the series as well, but that Honor Harrington is kind of a Mary Sue. And I do agree with the comment that she is a bit of a Mary Sue. Now, the Honor Harrington series is based on Horatio Hornblower series. It's basically that kind of character and series, but in space. And I think Horatio Hornblower was based upon an actual, was it Nathaniel Hawthorne or something like that? Actual person. The best way I would describe, if you like Star Trek and you like that kind of sort of science fiction space opera, where they get into the technical aspects, where they'll get into like the class of ship, the type of engines, the type of weapons, the tonnage, all that kind of stuff, accelerating and decelerating and all that stuff that deals with how you have space battles and tactics and whether you should cut and run or not, all that kind of like specific detail. If you like that stuff, then I recommend this series because this has all of that in it. So I also recently read the Vorkosigan Saga by Lois McMaster Bujold, another big, long space opera series. That one is much more sort of, I would describe much more swashbuckling. So I would describe Vorkosigan as Star Wars and Honor Harrington as Star Trek. But there's no magic in Vorkosigan, but it's just got that more fun sort of swashbuckling feel to it. So Honor Harrington is much more detailed. Honor Harrington gets into like all the different ranks and political power and political maneuverings and all that kind of stuff in detail. So if you like that stuff, then give Honor Harrington a try. Now, that said, there are 2 more, like 16-ish book series that are currently on hold. The first one is Cosmere by Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere. I've read Elantris and the first Mistborn book, and then I stopped because I realized there's no way I can begin to undertake Cosmere while I'm still reading something like Malazan. So I'm really, really determined to try to finish Malazan by the end of this year so that 2024 can be my Cosmere year. And I'm also put the Jim Butcher's Dresden Files on hold as well, because I was reading Honor Harrington and I was reading the Vorkosigan Saga, so I couldn't really fit in Dresden Files. I have read, I think, maybe the first 4 books. Really enjoyed it. And when I do get back to that, I'm probably just going to reread from the first book. And I can blow right through the first 4 books that I've already read, but just kind of as a refresher, because I did notice they were building on each other, specifically story-wise, revealing more and more of that sort of story world as you went. So I do want to go back and refresh myself with those first few books, which I can just kind of binge on audio and then till I catch up and then get on with that series. On to question number 2. Who is your favorite author? Okay, some of you already know the answer to this question. But before I tell you who my favorite author is, I will first tell you who my second favorite author of all time is. and that would be Andre Norton. Now, she was a prolific science fiction and fantasy writer. I don't know how many books she published overall, but it's a lot. And I think I own more books by Andre Norton than I own from any other author. I've read more books written by Andre Norton than I've read from any other author, easily. I probably own 30 or 40 Andre Norton books. They're all in storage in New York. And I've read at least another 10, 15, 20 of her books that I don't own. Growing up, finding them in the library that weren't available in the bookstores. So you take them out and you read them. She was my introduction into reading science fiction, because I started with fantasy, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis's Narnia, Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, just basically younger versions of Arthur and stuff. And then I started reading Andre Norton's Witchworld series as well in the middle of all that. And then I noticed she had some science fiction books. So I picked up a couple that looked really interesting, just got sucked right in to science fiction as a genre. And then started watching the Star Trek series, the original series. I think it was on reruns at that point. And then Star Wars came out in the theaters. And me and my older brother went and saw it on opening day. I think we saw like the second showing of that movie on opening day. We were living in Staten Island at the time. And yeah, so she was my gateway to science fiction, which then led to Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Heinlein, you name it, all those sci-fi readers. Samuel R. Delany is one of my absolute all-time favorite authors. And so she's responsible for opening that genre door for me. So she's my second favorite author. But my favorite is J.R.R. Tolkien. My day, everyone read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It just was sweeping people's imagination back then, particularly in places like New York and other areas. And my Uncle Barry brought my older brother The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, gave those to him. He started reading them, and then I became interested from just hearing about it and hearing the description of Bilbo's describing his birthday as the 11th instead of 111. And then I read them right after he did. And Tolkien has remained my favorite author since then. If I had to pick one favorite book, I guess a bonus sub-question to my favorite author, it would be The Silmarillion, Tolkien's The Silmarillion. And yes, it's not a form like a regular novel. It is very much reads like a sort of history, because it starts with the creation of the universe. It sort of reads almost like a sort of Bible-ish kind of setting for the opening passage, but then you get into all the events of the first age and then some of the second age. But it really does lean heavily into first age events. So J.R.R. Tolkien, hands down, no question, my favorite author. On to question number 3. So since Tolkien is my favorite author, let's go with who is my favorite character from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings novels. So not the TV show or any adaptations, just from the actual books. Who's my favorite character? Okay, this is a multi-answer question. There is an actual favorite character, but first, my favorite hobbit is Pippin, Peregrine Took. My favorite among the elves is Galadriel. And she has been my favorite of the elves. Well, would I say she's my favorite overall from Tolkien's whole legendarium of the elves? I don't know. It might be Feanor. Or it might be Finrod. Or it might be Fingolfin. There's so many great characters. But it's Feanor and Galadriel are my two favorites. So since Feanor is not in the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, he's not in those books, he was around in the first age, it is Galadriel. But my favorite character in the books is Aragorn. And I've always kind of viewed Aragorn and Gandalf as Tolkien's successful version, if you will, of Arthur and Merlin, where Arthur and Merlin failed in their quest to protect their land and their people. Aragorn and Gandalf succeed. And what I really love about Aragorn is he's a fascinating character. It's rare when you encounter a character in story that has the kind of burden that that man carries. Because he's not just carrying the legacy of his father or his grandfather, the entire history of his people from their very first moment on that world through him is sitting on his back, sitting on his shoulders. He's carrying his entire history and culture of his people. And if he fails, they end. The Edain end. They just pass into memory and eventually will be forgotten. So he will either rise up and at the very least match the greatest heights of his ancestors, or he will fail and his people will fall into dust. So that is not an easy thing, carrying the burden of 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years on your shoulders. If they're going to be doing Warner Brothers with Peter Jackson, Philippa Boyens, and that team involved, if they are indeed going to be making some more Third Age movies or whatever, and they're going to be doing it, I would really enjoy getting to see Aragorn's story. Like, give me a proper series following Aragorn's life. If you look at this man carries the guilt and duty of the failure of his people, because there was Gondor and Arnor, and no matter how bravely they fought, in the end they fell. It was really the Witch King who broke Arnor and ended the full kingdom to where Gondor itself is all that's left, and it's been dwindling through the ages since the last king rode to confront the Witch King and died, and then Stewarts took over. And they didn't know that there was another, basically, heir passed down from Elendil and Isildur. So, and Aragorn being that heir today in the Third Age. And it's really interesting to look at this man and everything he's done up to the point where he steps on the page in The Prancing Pony and Bree as Strider. He, again, carries the guilt of the failure of his family and the falling and ending of Arnor and the destruction of a lot of societies and people. And so he's spent his life in the dirt and the mud and crawling through ditches and fighting against evil. And not only fighting against evil, but doing it in a way where these peaceful people who live like in that part of Middle Earth don't even know this evil exists. They don't even know this threat that could wipe them out is just outside their doors. And Aragorn and what's left of his people are doing this like dirt work, this dirty work in the dark with, no fanfare, no reward, no nothing. Nobody even knows they're doing it except for a very select few. And this is the life they've been living now for quite a long time. And I particularly love when Aragorn really begins to finally emerge on the world stage, proclaiming who he is when they arrive at Edoras in Rohan. And he's told he has to leave their weapons outside. And he sets down Andoril. And you could see like the Númenórean suddenly just like unveiled in him in that moment, where he just commands them that no one will touch this blade, letting them know what this blade is, what it means, and basically implying who he is. And this is the first time we see this man, this Númenórean son, who has basically lived wrapped in these like shadows and cloaks, really hiding who he is. This is the first time he stepped out in the open as Aragorn, Isildur's heir. And one of my favorite moments in the entire story is that little scene there, where you suddenly realize who this man really is. Like, it really nails home who this man is for the first time, Because yeah, you were told it in earlier scenes, but this is the first time you see him unveil himself, and I just absolutely love that moment. So anyway, Aragorn is my favorite character in the Tolkien Lord of the Rings books, and Viggo did a really good job for the movie version that he was given to play. But yeah, absolutely. If you haven't read the books, book Aragorn. Such a great character. Question number 4. We're getting there. We're getting there because there's 5 questions. So this is question number 4. How do you decide which series you are going to read? Okay, I have a rough idea of what science fiction and fantasy series I still want to get around to reading. You know, I kind of know what they are. I don't have any hard set reading order for this is absolutely next no matter what. There's a bunch of things I want to read. And obviously Cosmere is one of them. Dresden Files is another. There's Stephen R. Donaldson's space opera Gap series. There's The Expanse. I believe the final Expanse book that finishes that story was published in the past year. So that has moved up as more of a priority read since it's actually done, I believe. So I kind of have the idea of things I want to get to. What is it? John Gwynn's, The Faithful and the Fallen or something. I think Malice is book 1. Robin Hobb's whole, I know there's a name for the whole series, but Farseer and all those books. I want to read all those. So there's a lot I really want to get to. And I don't have a hard reading order, though I do think most likely, fantasy-wise, Cosmere will be next up. So in the end, I kind of, it's really a matter of mood and intuition about what I think is the right next read for me. Right now it's Cosmere. You never know what might just pop up that might bump it. But I don't expect anything will. The only thing that will get in the way is if Winds of Winter gets an actual hard release date, because then I'm going to go back and reread all 5 Song of Ice and Fire books in the lead up to that, and then just deep dive into Winds of Winter. But outside of that, Cosmere's probably next. So, and what's really interesting is I do try to make a conscious choice to try to be reading at least one sci-fi series and one fantasy series. I've usually got one of each going. So right now, like I said, Malazan and Honor Harrington are the main fantasy, the main sci-fi. But the most interesting aspect of reading is as I get older, my time in reading time as well starts to become more noticeable, more important, more precious in a sense, though not in the Gollum, my precious thing. But it does. It becomes something that you're a lot more aware of as you begin to get older. I might have decades of reading ahead of me. I might not. Who knows? I have no idea. But I know there's probably more reading years behind me than there are left to me. And when you kind of reach that you pass that midway point, you do start to pay attention to time more. And especially as someone who, it's not just, oh, I'm going to read this book. It's, oh, I'm going to read this 16, 17, 18 book series. That's kind of what my choices generally tend to be. The amount of time that series is going to take is now kind of a factor where it never was growing up at all. It was like, ooh, a big, giant, juicy story with 20 books, hey, can't wait, let's do it. But now there's multiple choices of that size. And I really have to start prioritizing which one I think is worth investing that much time in over another one. So just something to think about. I mean, I think a lot of people sort of in this community, more on the reading side, this is a very reading-centric Q&A. I'm going to be doing a more movie, TV, animated live action adaptation on one of these, where I talk more along the lines of Star Wars, Star Trek, Cowboy Bebop, all that kind of stuff. But that's more not book-centric, but just story, movie, TV, animated, live-action stuff. But I know the reading part here, this community tends to be on the younger side. And these things might not just be things that are even on your radar yet. I don't know. Maybe they are. It may be something younger generations do actually pay more attention to than prior generations did. Final question for this me Q&Aing myself. Okay, is there a book not currently on my TBR that I really want to read this year? At the moment, surprisingly, the answer to that is no, not at the moment. But again, that could change at any moment. As I said, if tomorrow we get Winds of Winter is publishing November 1st this year, okay, all my reading plans out the window if that happens. But in general, there's nothing specific that's not already on my 2023 kind of TBR radar. You never know, something could come out of the blue and just completely changes that. Something might just show up and say, hey, you're reading me next, no matter what you're doing. In fact, put that book down right now and read me. That might happen too. But right now, no, there isn't anything that I don't already have on my radar that I really want to just shove in there. It's only early March. It's March 7th, 2023, recording this. If you have any questions for me, you can leave them down below in the comments. I'm going to post a community post at some point soon where I'll ask formally for questions for an audience crafted Q&A, question and answer session, because these are kind of fun to do. And if you've watched this video and you're in this sort of video making community yourself, and you want to take these 5 questions and kind of make them into a book tab, go forth and do it as a book tag if you want. If you do, just give me a shout out, link my video in your description, etiquette, all that stuff, yada, yada, yada.